1 years of our Alfred Dreyfus, we recall vividly how, in spite of unimaginable oppression, he retained his pride in his Jewish heritage. How, regardless of all that was taken from him, he never abandoned his belief in the possibility of all things, particularly through education. How, no matter the obstacles he faced, he remained tenacious and resilient, never giving up on his dreams. And above all, in spite of how many loved ones he lost, he continued to love fiercely, creating a family he treasured unto his last breath. Claudia and Mark, Brett, Marissa, I'm trying to look at each of you, but you're not sitting in my, Sam, Max, Spencer, to Judah, Joshua, Evan and Natalie, Annie and Philippe, and the ECPI family, your father, grandfather, great-grandfather, brother-in-law, uncle, founder, and friend, was a constant, loving, and generous presence in all of your lives. His legacy of goodness and values live on in and through each of you, not only in the memories you cherish, but most importantly, through your words and deeds, as you strive to live your lives by the example he set for you. The following reading speaks to Alfred's greatest truth, that life is, above all, our most precious blessing. And the child asked, "Tell me of life." And the wise old man answered, "Life, my child, is a mystery. We do not ask to be born, nor do we even understand the meaning of birth, of creation. We grow and we experience life's pleasures and pains. We love, and slowly, oh so slowly, we come to realize that we have become what we are. At that moment, we humble ourselves before the mystery of life and quietly say, 'Though I knew not, I have been granted the most precious gift of all, the gift of life.' And the child asked, 'Tell me of death.' And the wise old man answered, 'Death, my child, is a mystery. It is the inevitable return of the gift of life, the gift which came to free us. We live as the trustee of that mysterious being, of that unexplainable becoming. Yes, you and I are but the trustees of life. We nurture it, we delight in it, we give of it to others. And at the appointed time, we sadly, yet with pride, return it from whence it came. The beauty, my child, is that what we are, what we have become, remains long after the gift has been returned. It remains as a precious keepsake with our loved ones who live on. No truer words could be spoken about our Alfred Dreyfus. For what he is, what he became, will remain for countless generations, a precious keepsake for all who were the beneficiaries of his vision, love, and generosity. For no people are these words truer than for his family, from whom we will hear today, beginning with two of his grandsons. First, Brett Levy, followed by Sam Dreyfus.
Thank you to everyone for coming. Losing my grandfather was painful not only to my family, to his ECPI family, to the whole community because of who Alfred Dreyfus was as an individual, but his passing also represents a grave collective loss of one of the world's last survivors who could testify to the catastrophe of the Holocaust. And maybe even more importantly, we lost one of the very last who lived, who emerged from, who was formed by, and exemplified the values of the dazzling German Jewish society of pre-World War II, whose personality was intertwined with this exquisite culture and sense of purpose. Throughout his life and everything he did, my grandfather transmitted the values of this pre-war community, and now we were all terribly impoverished without a living example of how high a person can strive. Since my earliest days, my grandfather transmitted his values to me. He articulated them verbally in his stories, and he communicated them in everything he did. The way he talked, walked, dressed, ate. Everything was with an elegance and infused with meaning. Everything was done with a precision and purpose. He was raised to aspire for refinement and discretion in everything he did. He stemmed from great people who had transmitted their values and dreams to him, and this is how he lived too, always offering an example of the human being striving for his highest potential, whether through innovation and industriousness or by cleaving to beauty and knowledge. I'll illustrate the point through just one example, classical music. For my grandfather, classical music was not just a matter of personal taste or a form of entertainment. No, classical music represented the highest form of human achievement. It was almost holy, the creative act, composing and performing music that awakens the soul and directs people to lofty thoughts and emotions. This was something he cherished all his days. Two of his happiest childhood memories revolved around classical music. He never forgot his mother singing and playing the piano. I think this was the soundtrack in his head in his last months and years when he spoke little but gazed every day at his mother's photograph. The other happy childhood memory was about a special grandfather-grandson bond. His grandfather, Philip Lieblish, the famed kosher hotelier of Baden-Baden, would take him by the hand and bring him, his eldest grandson, to the spa town's outdoor classical music performances Sunday mornings. I think my grandfather tried to transmit the same love and reverence for classical music to me, continuing this grandfather-grandson tradition. Whenever I saw him as a child or teenager, he had new cassette tapes for me with recordings of classical performances. He was passing down a family legacy, a yearning for connection to greatness, to beauty, to creativity, to refinement. The most pronounced of my grandfather's transmissions were his stories of growing up in Europe, where he saw the best and worst of humanity. My grandfather shared his story with my sister and me hundreds of times from our early childhood and never stopped giving anecdotes about his miraculous escapes and the colorful figures in our family history. These accounts inspired me to become a historian and to deepen my own research into my grandfather's history in archives in Germany, Switzerland, France. My grandfather was born in 1923 in Rastatt, Germany, in a region where his ancestors had lived for 1,000 years. His father was an industrialist who produced boxes for cigars, chocolates, perfume. His mother was a very cultured woman, born among the musicians and poets and visiting royalty in Baden-Baden, and raised in her family's strictly kosher, strictly elegant hotel. My grandfather was the firstborn son with two younger brothers. Summers and Jewish holidays were spent in Baden-Baden with his grandparents in their hotel in the shadow of a castle-topped mountain at the entrance to the Black Forest. His was a typical Jewish family of the region. They were firmly connected to Jewish tradition, attending synagogue regularly and being conversant in Jewish texts, but also strongly German, fiercely patriotic, with devotion to high European culture, music, art, literature, and to the lush natural landscapes of Central Europe. My grandfather attended a German public school and separately received religious instruction at the Rastatt synagogue. It was a fairy tale childhood of sledding in the snow, summer camp in the mountains, and a close-knit, loving family. It did not seem like good fortune at the time, but a rabid anti-Semitism emerged specifically in Rastatt earlier than in most of Germany. The Jews of Rastatt saw very quickly what was to unfold. There was a strong local Nazi party in the early 1930s that published a newspaper slandering local Jews, including my great-grandfather. My grandfather remembered watching a crowd of his neighbors in 1932 attacking his religious studies instructor in the street, the poor man bleeding as crowds cheered and then vandalized the synagogue. When my grandfather suffered anti-Jewish abuse from his classmates and teachers, his father understood that time had come to leave Germany. The family relocated across the Rhine River to nearby Strasbourg in France. After a few years of rebuilding their lives and learning a new language, the family again moved as the winds of war blew across Europe. My great-grandfather, a brilliant man with a strategic mind, always one step ahead of the Nazis, did not want to be so close to the German border. He took the family to a suburb of Paris, and again they began anew, with new schools and new jobs. When World War II broke out, my great-grandfather was arrested by the French government because he was German, even though, of course, he was Jewish, and Germany had stripped him of his citizenship as a Jew. Suddenly, my great-grandmother was alone with her 3 sons. My grandfather had to mature quickly to help his mother as the eldest son. Soon, German air raids began in their town. The family would jump out of bed and race to a nearby cave to escape the bombs which took the lives of some of their neighbors. Later, the German invasion began. The German army approached Paris. My grandfather, his mother, and brothers fled their home suddenly in the middle of breakfast while under machine gun fire and arrived at a railway station in Paris. Tens of thousands of civilians packed the station, trying to escape the city for safer regions not under German attack. Authorities called on everybody to leave the overcrowded station, but my great-grandmother took her sons, hopped on a train car, and they fell asleep from extreme exhaustion. When they woke up, the train was moving and heading south. At some point in the journey, local officials came aboard and welcomed the refugee family and gave them a place to stay in the stables of a crumbling old castle. Meanwhile, my great-grandfather was in a French prison. When Germany invaded, they released all the non-Jewish Germans and kept the Jews locked up. But God was smiling on the family. The German prison commander had served with my great-grandfather in the German army in World War I on the Russian front. He arranged to have his friend, Mr. Dreyfus, released from prison, from which the Jews would soon be deported to death camps, and instead reassigned to the German war effort because of his technical knowledge. He allowed my great-grandfather to go home for one night to inform his family. When he reached home, my great-grandfather saw uneaten breakfast still on the table. He understood his family had fled. The next morning, German forces knocked on his door to pick him up for his new job. He escaped through a back window and began a months-long clandestine journey to find his family. All this time, my grandfather was with his mother and brothers in a tiny village in southern France. My grandfather worked in a local shop to earn money for the family. They farmed, hunted, and fished to get food, but they were happy. Eventually, they were joined by my great-grandfather. By 1942, the situation for Jews in all parts of France became very dangerous. In the summer, my grandfather's uncle was arrested by the Germans. He sent the family heartbreaking letters, which they would only receive after the war, saying he was sitting in a concentration camp without socks and shoes, without food. Could they please send something? He would eventually be deported and murdered in Auschwitz. One day in September 1942, a stranger with an Austrian accent came into the shop where my grandfather worked and said, "If I were you, I'd escape tonight, you and your family." My teenage grandfather did not grasp the message, but his parents understood perfectly. Jews were being rounded up town by town and deported to death camps. Swiftly, my great-grandfather arranged with a local farmer to hide his family. They were hidden in a barn between pigs and sheep for weeks as the police came knocking on all the doors of Jews to arrest them. The family was saved. Hidden behind sacks of grain, they could not emerge or make a sound. But soon, the farmer decided he could not risk hiding a Jewish family any longer. My great-grandfather decided his family had to leave France for the safety of neutral Switzerland. He had an acquaintance linked to the anti-Nazi resistance living nearby in Toulouse, the city of Toulouse. In the dark of night, the family left their hiding spot at the farm and took a taxi to Toulouse. They approached a checkpoint, and the driver, seeing the stress of the Dreyfus family and recognizing one of the policemen as his friend, rolled down the window and shouted, "They're okay," and the taxi was waved through without the police inspecting their papers, marking the family as Jewish. In Toulouse, they were able to secure false identification papers. They made their way by train toward Switzerland. Numerous times along the way, the police boarded trains looking for Jews. They arrested Jews even with false papers. Each time, the Dreyfus family was safe. My grandfather would tear up, remembering these miracles, when against all odds, his family escaped deportation, even as they saw others dragged off trains to their deaths. When they reached the Geneva Lake, with Switzerland across the water, they were not the only Jewish refugees fleeing, and Switzerland decided to tighten their borders. The Dreyfus family had planned to escape across the lake in a fishing boat, but now the Swiss were patrolling the lake heavily. The family had to look to the imposing Alps and contemplate fleeing on foot over the high mountains. Smugglers were contacted and paid. The family was placed on rickety trucks covered with bundles of straw. The family ascended high up to an alpine village and then further up past the last houses, through forests to a clearing at the edge of the tree line, 5,000 feet in elevation. They spent the night in the hayloft of the smuggler's cabin. They didn't sleep. They heard the smugglers below arguing all night whether it was more profitable to take the Dreyfus family over the border or turn them over to the Germans, who offered a ransom for handing over Jews. In the end, they agreed to guide the family to the border in exchange for more money. The beleaguered Dreyfus family had no choice but to agree. The next morning, the day of the first snow at the high altitude, the family set off with their guides towards the border. The smugglers said they were lucky with the bad weather as there were fewer police patrols. My great-grandmother wore her city shoes and suffered greatly. The path was grueling. It wasn't even a path, not a marked trail, just a thin ledge above a death-defying drop down the valley, with a steep, imposing mountain on the other side and a ridge leading to Switzerland ahead. I can testify to this because I returned to the exact spot and recreated this hike 2 years ago in honor of the 80th anniversary of our family being saved. The family was running for their lives in very difficult terrain. At a vantage point about an hour from the border, the smugglers suddenly announced they were leaving. They pointed to Switzerland and said, "You can take it from here." The family had no choice but to continue. Not much later, a group of bandits, no doubt linked to the smugglers, accosted the family and demanded payment. They pointed to some figures in the distance and said they were from the German Gestapo, and they threatened to turn over the family if they didn't pay. The Dreyfus family had already given away all its money to the smugglers, so my great-grandmother surrendered her engagement ring. The bandits were appeased, and the family proceeded. They climbed up to the spot marking the border and emotionally stepped into Switzerland. They were leaving behind so many members of their family they could not rescue, but they had secured their freedom. Or so they thought. After 15 minutes of descent down the valley into Switzerland, they were arrested by a border policeman. For days, the family sat in prison in limbo. Ultimately, they were allowed refuge in Switzerland. Many Jewish families who reached the Swiss border were sent back, but the Dreyfus family was very lucky. The family was sent to a refugee camp where they regained their strength, but then the family members were split up and sent to different labor camps. The Swiss gave refuge to many Jews, but made them work for the right to stay in the country. In one camp, my grandfather and one of his brothers worked very hard under difficult conditions, chopping trees in the dead of winter. Later, they were sent to another camp where they built roads and bridges by day, but in their free time enjoyed the camaraderie among the young Jewish men all living together at one camp, all refugees from a similar background, giving lectures and debating politics and hiking together. My grandfather rarely saw his parents, each at separate labor camps, for the remainder of the war, but the family was safe. They would yet learn how fortunate they were. As mentioned, my great-grandfather's brother was not lucky, deported from France and murdered. One of my great-grandmother's sisters was deported and murdered, as was her husband. My grandfather's 5-year-old first cousin, Miriam, was deported with her mother, but there's no record of what happened to her. She vanished off the face of the earth. His whole life, my grandfather searched for her fate. Maybe somehow her mother had been able to hide her with non-Jews in the midst of their deportation. We'll never know what happened to little Miriam, who was most likely murdered as well, but her fate haunted my grandfather terribly. After the war, my great-grandfather, a veteran of the First World War and a refugee of the Second, feared that Europe may yet see more war and turmoil, and decided one of his sons should immigrate to America and start anew here, where he might save the rest of the family if necessary. My grandfather arrived here with a few dollars and one suitcase, and everyone in this room who loved and respected him is testament to the impact he had in his new country. My grandfather appreciated how lucky he was, how many miracles he'd witnessed, how he'd seen the worst of human society, the Nazi killers pulling Jews off trains, and the smugglers taking advantage of desperate refugees, but also the best, including his parents, who maintained their resolve and human dignity while keeping the family safe despite so much danger. It is now up to us to cherish and perpetuate my grandfather's legacy, the heritage of pre-war German Jews, of their refinement and dedication to Jewish tradition that he wholeheartedly exemplified, the culture of survival and valuing life above all else, respecting human initiative and challenging ourselves to be the best we can be, looking to art, nature, literature, to our faith, to uplift ourselves, to accomplish lofty goals, fighting tyranny and defending American values of freedom, and continuing to transmit our family stories and the noble values they illustrate. Thank you.
My grandfather always liked to do difficult things, which is why I chose to speak after Brett. What does it mean to be a role model? By definition, a role model is a person looked to by others as an example to be imitated. For some, a role model might be a historical figure, someone they read about in books or see on TV. I was fortunate enough to have mine much closer to home, my grandfather, Alfred Dreyfus. Many people admire their grandfathers, but I truly believe mine was one of a kind. The life he led and the obstacles he overcame are nothing short of remarkable. Alfred's life was unique. He grew up in Germany during what I can only assume was the worst time ever to be a young Jewish boy there. Labeled as an enemy of the state at just 9 years old, his own country turned on him, and he spent his youth on the run, always one step ahead of the Nazis. He watched his world unravel before his eyes. Yet despite unimaginable hardships, he kept pushing forward. In every sense of the word, he became a survivor. He understood that the richness of existence comes from living with intentionality and breaking through the monotony. He believed it was up to each of us to imbue our lives with meaning, that life is only meaningless if we believe it is. Life dealt him many bad hands, but every now and then he received a few good cards. It was up to him to decide how to play that hand, and he always chose wisely. After the war, he arrived in the United States by himself with no formal education, no money, just his mind and his will. His first job was an electrical technician. In 1966, he founded ECPI, now one of the largest technology-focused universities in the nation. Even in his later years, he always seemed to be a step ahead, spotting the next big trend or picking the stock that everyone else wished they had bought. If he were here today, I have no doubt that he'd be walking up to each and every one of you, waving a note card with NVIDIA scribbled on it, and insisting you invest immediately. His fellow electronics enthusiast and NVIDIA founder, Jensen Huang, said at a recent graduation speech, "I wish upon you ample doses of pain and suffering, not out of cruelty, but because real success is forged through resilience." This idea reflects not only my grandfather's life, but a truth of life. Without hardship, there is no growth. Without pain, can we truly experience pleasure? He didn't let the war that nearly destroyed him define who he was. Instead, he found strength from overcoming it. In reflection, 3 words capture why he has always been my role model: determined, humble, and righteous. What does it mean to do the right thing when no one is watching? I believe my grandfather lived his entire life by this principle. Perhaps his intrinsic motivation stemmed from a deep understanding that while the world could be cruel and complex, that doesn't mean that we have to be. We always have the power to act with integrity, to shape our own destiny, and to seize every opportunity that life gives us. He saw potential where others saw impossibility. While others dismissed computers as a passing fad, he envisioned a future transformed by technology. But my grandfather wasn't chasing trends. He was driven by a vision to open doors for those who, like him, once faced limited options. His empathy fueled his determination to create new opportunities for others. Despite all his success, he remained deeply humble. He never sought the spotlight or indulged in extravagance. There was no big house, no lavish lifestyle, and no vices, at least that we know of. Instead, he cherished life's simple pleasures: his family, the success of his students, and anything that challenged his mind. When I was young, I fondly remember visiting my grandparents, whom we called Oma and Papa. Oma would prepare the most delicious German recipes, which, if you've ever tried German food, is quite a feat in itself. Meanwhile, Papa and I would play chess on the kitchen table. I took immense pride in my winning streak against him. He'd raise an eyebrow and feign surprise every time I captured one of his pieces, exclaiming in his thick German accent, "You got me." It wasn't until much later that I began to suspect the man who built a university might not be so easily outwitted by a child. But he let me bask in those victories, knowing that sometimes the best way to teach isn't by winning, but by letting others believe they can succeed on their own. In contrast, my dad never let me win a single game. He believes in an approach similar to trial by fire. But perhaps fathers and grandfathers have different roles to play. My grandfather beat the odds. He persevered through a war where so many perished, founded a school where others failed, and was married for 69 years, maybe his most remarkable feat of all. He lived a century, not just in years, but in experiences. He never dwelled on the setbacks, he simply kept pushing forward. In his later years, the doctors would tell us he only had a few weeks. He outlived every one of those predictions, and even some of those doctors. It was only when his mind and his body fully deteriorated that he finally found his peace. As his caretaker Quentin poetically said, he had exhausted every means of survival. When your mind and your body go, what's left? I would have to think that's the spirit. In Jewish tradition, there isn't a conventional view of the afterlife. The emphasis is often on the life we live in this world. We often say the spirit lives on through the good deeds we've done and the memories we leave in the minds of others. As I reflect on his life and legacy, I'm reminded that the greatest things we leave behind aren't the accomplishments or the accolades, but the way we make people feel, the values we instill, and the love that we give. My grandfather made us feel valued, inspired, and loved. His legacy isn't just in the institution he built, but in the lives he touched and the example he set for us all. And so, if I can leave you with one thought today, let it be this. My grandfather showed us that the quietest lives are often the most profound, and the strongest impact is made not with words, but with actions. May he inspire all of us to live with an unwavering commitment to do what is right and to do it very, very quietly.
I'm going to call you up. Just give me a second. I cannot even put words to how immensely proud your grandfather was of both of you. Both spoke beautifully, such amazing tributes. Rabbi Alvin Fine has written, "Birth is a beginning and death a destination, but as we have heard, life is a journey. A going, a growing from stage to stage, from childhood to maturity and youth to age, from innocence to awareness and ignorance to knowing, from foolishness to discretion and then perhaps to wisdom, from weakness to strength or strength to weakness and often back again, from health to sickness and back we pray to health again, from offense to forgiveness, from loneliness to love, from joy to gratitude, from pain to compassion and grief to understanding, from fear to faith, from defeat to defeat to defeat, until looking backward or ahead, we see that victory lies not in some high place along the way, but in having made the journey stage by stage a sacred pilgrimage. Birth is a beginning and death a destination. But life is a journey, a sacred pilgrimage made stage by stage, from birth to death to life everlasting. Alfred's sacred life journey lives on in and through each of us, but through no individuals more so than his children. To honor his memory, we will now hear from his beloved daughter Claudia, and finally from his beloved son Mark.
I first want to thank everyone attending today and remembering Dad. Dad leaves behind a rich business and family legacy. There are many memories to recall, but I have a few I'd like to share of growing up and the early days of ECPI. From a young age, I recall Dad always reading periodicals like Scientific American, anything in print on investments, and listening to classical music. As he got older, this also included whatever medical newsletters he could have mailed to him. He highlighted each publication with the ideas he viewed as important for continued health. As a family, we have many memories of Dad incorporating these foods into his diet. 1 cup of blueberries every day, the equivalent of 1 tomato, 4 cups of coffee, not too much red meat, and when he ordered an egg, it was half of an egg. We all used to laugh at his insistence on adding these items to his daily diet, but once he lived to almost 101, he surely had the last laugh. While living in the Northeast, before starting ECPI, we were skiing many weekends in Vermont and having picnics on weekends in the summer at Lake George or Thatcher State Park in New York State. Mom would prepare all the picnic food, and Dad's goal was to make the biggest fire possible to grill on without burning the surrounding forest down. Dad was working in electronics, but always knew he wanted to start his own business. He first started investigating what type of business in the early 60s. This was before the internet existed, and research had to be gathered by going to libraries or reading periodicals. I recall sitting on the lion statues outside of the flagship New York City Library on Fifth Avenue. Dad would be inside for hours while we waited for him to finish his extensive work. This went on over several years. He carefully concluded that computers would be the future, even though many were not convinced that they would be popular or useful. At that time, it was a little like science fiction. He also had personally experienced the impact education and specific skills training can make on a student's life. The beginning years of ECPI were in the Janif office building with 2 offices and 2 classrooms and a reception area with all orange furniture. Dad loved orange. It represented high energy to him. There were a few key punch machines and card sorters for students in a small glassed-in area on view from the reception area, the fishbowl. During the summer months, I would help with the reporting and boxes of documents that many government agencies required, all on paper, of course. I also remember the many days of Dad worrying if there would be enough funds to issue payroll to employees. So Dad could be at the office as many hours as possible. We lived a few hundred feet away from ECPI. We lived in a low-rise apartment complex behind Janif Shopping Center. Our backyard was the delivery entrances to each of the shopping center's stores, trucks, and loading docks. Dad worked many hours every day of the week until he retired. ECPI was his baby. He had started it and nursed it through many growing pains. Starting a business, of course, has its many challenges, but this new idea in a new city by an immigrant with an accent had its own set of ups and downs. He had the important ability to be able to sacrifice a lot to build his dream. He spent any funds that he acquired to reinvest in ECPI, not on anything in his personal life, except for essentials. Of course, while growing up, it wasn't always easy to understand his vision and comprehend why we had never owned a home. As time passed, I began to understand his dream and witness how ECPI was changing students' lives. I also saw Dad's commitment to each and every student. For decades, he was the proudest person in the room at each and every graduation ceremony. Today, I would also like to talk about Dad's last chapter, and I'm going to ask Quentin Floyd and Karen Shaver to join me up here. About 6 years ago, Dad has a serious infection and was sent to the emergency room. The hospital staff was doubtful he would survive because of his age. Well, to everyone's surprise, he snapped back pretty quickly, and that began a journey. While in the hospital recovering, he kept trying to get out of bed, to escape, to remove his IV, and so it became clear that he needed someone to watch him in his room. I inquired, and in walked Quentin, a CNA. I watched Dad with Quentin, and I saw an immediate connection. Quentin was patient with Dad and understood him. He had the knowledge, experience, and right personality to deal with this feisty patient. I hired Quentin to watch Dad, and from that day forward, Quentin rarely left Dad's side for over 6 years, 24/7, even through the COVID years. Dad was transferred quickly to a rehab facility, and Quentin and Dad easily developed a bond and lasting friendship. Dad could just look at Quentin, and Quentin knew what he wanted. Quentin always treated Dad with respect, and he was extremely dedicated. He knew every one of Dad's expressions and what they meant, and believe me, there were many. Dad was always perfectly groomed and attended to. He would have a clean shave every single day. They would spend days outdoors, watching movies, listening to music, and sometimes just being silly. We knew we had a gem taking care of Dad. We are so grateful for Quentin's TLC because we know that he extended Dad's life. After 3 years, I was advised to put Dad on hospice care, primarily due to his age. He was 97 years old at the time. Soon, we were fortunate to meet the next guardian angel in Dad's world, Karen, an experienced RN, now doing hospice care. She had worked decades in the emergency room and then ICU and recovery prior to working in hospice. Karen became the brilliant medical mind to guide Dad through any issue for 3 years. Luckily, he was healthy, no medication, but overall, old age issues and any minor medical issues were expertly resolved by Karen. Karen and Quentin became the dream team. Karen would always use touch to connect with Dad, and it was with the sincerity of a family member. As a family, we were very fortunate to have these two by Dad's side. Their dedication, kindness, and love carried Dad through every day until his final hours. They treated him with respect, and most important, he had his dignity till his last breath. What made this chapter of Dad's life so special is not just the impact Karen and Quentin made on Dad, but also the impact he made on them and others who came across his path. Even though he had more limited verbal skills in his last years, he kept his great sense of humor. He always stayed positive, even as old age set in. He inspired many with his perseverance, but his charm and big smile brightened everyone's day. He loved the hugs and pecks on the cheek that many would give him, and he perked up each time music was played and he could direct the music with his hands. Dad had amazing resilience. Multiple times he went into what I call hibernation, sleeping for several days and eating little. A few of those times, Karen called me and said, "This could be the beginning of the end." And each time, I would say, "Remember, he's the cat with 9 lives times 5. He'll be back and ready to rumble." She would laugh, and lo and behold, a few days later, I would get a video from Quentin of Dad waking up early and eating an enormous breakfast. He rebounded more times than I can remember. Quentin was so inspired by Dad's commitment to education that he studied on his computer during Dad's sleeping hours to become a medical and healthcare training provider who can now train on 13 curriculums in an elaborate mobile unit. Congratulations. I never could have imagined how much of a difference these two individuals would make on Dad's closing chapter. It simply shows how much of an impact you can make as a healthcare professional when you truly care and embrace the patients who cross your path. I want to close with the most important memory I will have of my father. Dad and I had a special connection, that magical father-daughter bond. Every time we were together, there was always a love with knowing glances and holding hands. It was mutually gratifying in his last years. I will always remember how sweet and tender those moments were.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for coming. It really is heartwarming, and in particularly these last several weeks, the outpouring of just the cards and letters and calls and text messages has been overwhelming, and my father would have been truly honored by it. It's hard to stand up here after Brett and Sam and my sister filling in most of my father's life. You know, I've had to think about this for probably 15 years, what I'm going to say, because, as my sister said, the last 6 years is like, okay, now it's, you know, when am I going to have to make this speech? So my speech over the years has probably changed a little bit. But my dad was what I would consider to be unconventional, multidimensional, and he always used to say, after me, they broke the mold, okay? And that he was unique in every respect. As you heard earlier, my father's youth was, you know, abruptly cut short, and those, you know, critical years of being a teenager, he really didn't have. I mean, he lost those. But he always stayed a kid at heart, and he would remember fondly some of his days in the Boy Scouts when he moved to France. And I think he always was a Boy Scout at heart. And he would say from time to time to me, he said, you know, Hitler had a ticket for me for Auschwitz, but I never cashed that ticket. And, you know, I wasn't going to get on that train. And you've heard that, you know, his family narrowly escaped, but there were many people along the way that helped him and helped his family. And he never forgot that. And as Brett mentioned, he was constantly researching family history. He was always reading about the Holocaust. He reflected on the horrors of the lives of his loved ones. And, but he also had another brush with death that when he came to New York City, he was driving in New York City one day, and a truck carrying pipes stopped short, and the pipes came through the windshield of his car and barely nicked him. And he said, well, you know, he had another life, and, you know, he was able to survive that as well. My dad was endlessly grateful for those men and women who stormed the beaches of Normandy. He said when they heard that day that the Americans, you know, basically were coming onto the shores of Europe, he felt that he was actually, you know, his life was going to be saved. And he always remembered that and respected veterans for that. After the war, you know, everybody was looking to get some kind of training, and he wanted to be a photographer. So he tried to go to photography school, but it was full. So he ended up going to radio electricity school. But he always kept his passion for photographs alive. So he would always be the person that took the photographs. And he would sit there and he would try and make the picture perfect. And we would all be groaning, take the picture already. We're waiting. And But he always said, I'm going to get one good picture of everyone, and he certainly did. He got a good photograph of everyone in the family. My dad had an unyielding curiosity for technology, and as my sister said, he was always reading, Scientific American and technical magazines. But one of the things he did when we were young is, many of you probably don't know or remember that there was the New York World's Fair, and it was in the 1960s, and they had all these futuristic pavilions. And he dragged us there 10 times, and we had to go see the futuristic pavilion and, see what the technology that was coming. And what's incredible is a lot of the things that were shown then, are, today there are versions of it, but still he was always, thinking about what was coming. And he also had this deep love for tools. I mean, my dad never saw a tool he didn't want to buy. So he collected tools, and he had a tool for everything. If something broke, he could always know that my dad had the tool to fix it. And then sometimes, he liked to tinker with things and try and repair things. And many times, he'd take something apart, and there'd be a part that's still left over. And he would say, that's okay, it'll still work. Don't worry about it. And then he also created contraptions. And he would tell the story how when I was a baby, that he would tie a rope to the baby carriage in the apartment that we were in, and he'd kick the carriage down the hallway and then pull the rope back, because he really didn't want to get up and push the carriage. But my dad was a cultured and refined man, and one of sophistication. But he never watched sports, never followed any teams. But he devoured newspapers and documentaries, and as you heard, classical music. He cherished, time with family and dinners with family, but it always had to be a restaurant with a tablecloth. It had to have a tablecloth. And fast food just wasn't for him. And he always wore a suit to everything. He was always proper. He wore a suit, and he always embodied dignity and class. When you talk about my dad, you can't talk about him without talking about my mother. Unfortunately, we lost my mom several years ago, but they were inseparable. And they were together for over 70 years. And she was his constant companion, and in fact, helped him when he started ECPI. She was the bookkeeper for many years. And then after, they certainly traveled the world together, but their lives were woven together, and they could even finish each other's sentences. And even later in life, when he was unable to see her during COVID, he was always looking to try and find my mother and see where she was. And he would talk about her as well. He was an active guy. I mean, even though he wasn't a sports fan, he loved staying active. And as my sister mentioned, we skied in the early days of skiing. And he took me along when I was just 3. But we went skiing one time, this was, I guess, 20 years ago, when he was 80, and he said, I want to go skiing. I said, what? You want to go skiing? You're 80 years old. He goes, yep, I'm going skiing, So he decided to go skiing, and certainly one morning he went and skied just to prove to himself that he could do it. And he did just fine. But then he said, okay, now I'm done. And he was always quick on his feet. He was always walk fast. Everybody says Speedy Gonzales. He was walking fast, and he also drove fast. And so he always had, his lawyer on speed dial for those minor infractions that he'd have. And those of you, from Norfolk, Pete Decker, he was real close friends, knew Pete really well. My father, growing up in the aftermath of the Great Depression, had the frugality of a survivor, and he was always mindful of value. He would go to auctions and buy equipment. He sourced equipment. He found the most efficient ways to get things done. And his frugality was a source of pride and not a limitation. And he taught us all to, basically accept those resources that you have and make the best of them. And as you heard earlier, he had some unique quirks about food, and he always ate berries, and he would tell everybody, to eat these things, but he also liked cherries, and my mother would always say she'd have to carry sacks of cherries home from the market because he would consume so many. And then he started planting cherry pits outside his window, and the cherry tree grew so big it like obscured the view that he had of the lake. He also was a big fan of the Schwarzwald cake, which comes from the Black Forest, because it reminded him of his youth and also his mother, who was a great chef. There's only one person that can be a founder, and my father, of course, founded ECPI, and he was a visionary, but he was very resilient and had incredible willpower, and he always beat the odds. And throughout his life, everyone underestimated him, including family members. But he always felt it was a matter of just getting the job done, that hard work will get you through your mistakes, and he wanted to avoid the really big mistakes. And he also often quoted Intel's Andy Grove, who said, "Only the paranoid survive." And his real talent, of course, was looking over the horizon, which, you prepare for the future, whether it's good or bad, and see where things are going. And I guess he learned that from his father, Manfred. Before he founded ECPI, he was working, and he had to, collect the capital to be able to start it. And he actually sold mutual funds door to door. And he would sell mutual funds, and then he started investing in the stock market. And from that, he was able to get the capital to, start the business. But he had this natural business acumen. He always knew he wanted to be in business. He always knew he wanted to be his own boss. And he basically, through his research, he was able to invest wisely. And he was the best stock picker I've ever known. He always spotted trends. And as Sam said, he'd have these cards and, trying to explain to people. He used to have cards that said Apple on it. And he would go in the grocery stores and he would give it to people. And they'd say third aisle. And he said, no, buy Apple. You got to buy the stock. And this was many years ago. In the early years, he didn't take any vacations. He started ECPI at age 42, which is kind of old. Not old now, but kind of old. And he wouldn't take vacations for many years with my mom. And the first class only had 8 students, but he kept on going. And he overcame a lot of setbacks, and he stayed true to his beliefs in education. He was constantly reinvesting in the latest equipment. He was incredibly loyal to his employees and always treated everyone with respect. And my sister mentioned the color orange. I think we still have some orange furniture, but he insisted that classrooms had to have windows because you have to have this good environment for people to learn in, and he wanted to make sure that the learning environment was great. At one point, there were over 100 schools like ECPI teaching computer skills that were in association with a company in New York. And when he would go to these meetings in New York where there were these 100 schools, the executives there always thought that he was going to be the first school to close. And today, all 100 schools are closed, and he's the only one that was still open. So it kind of tells you that sometimes perseverance can really help. But he's empowered thousands with new opportunities. And he was always proud of our graduates. I mean, he always said, we're all about graduates. And in the 90s, when major companies like IBM and Texas Instruments, Motorola, and Micron were recruiting graduates by the dozen, he just thought that was the best, result that is possible. And everyone, of course, knew my father as Mr. D. He really ensured ECPI's success with his passion for quality and student advocacy, which also he started an association in Virginia to represent schools that were skills schools, the Virginia Association of Private Career Schools, and giving students a voice in Richmond. And then he also taught me how to represent students when we went to Washington to meet with congressional offices. But as you heard earlier, family meant everything to my father, and even though there were long distances with him and his brothers, and he would have been overjoyed today to see my cousin Philippe and his wife Judith here, because he always loved seeing family and loved seeing his family from France because they were just so far away, and he would do anything to see them. He had a unique way in humor, and he would always come out with some of his, I guess, words from his youth. And if somebody was a big talker and talked too much, because he didn't talk too much, he would call them bobblers. He goes, oh, that guy's a bobbler. And he would always read tales to his grandchildren of Max and Moritz, which is a German folk tale about these two kids that are really mischievous. And I guess, we grew up as a family of mischievous kids as well. Maybe it runs in the family. And then he'd call us Lausbubs, which in German means rascal. And says, yeah, he would always say that every time something would happen that, he thought we were like pushing the line, saying, oh, you Lausbub, and he'd laugh about it. But he was always animated, even at 100. He would use his hands and his face to make expressions, even after he was unable to communicate with words. But in the end, my father's life exemplified resilience, humility, foresight, and generosity. And he realized that while you can give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, but if you teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. And that was really his mission. He just didn't teach skills, though. He really helped countless students achieve their own American dream. And we're also grateful for all that my father has showed us. And I think that with his passing, his story has elicited an incredible response. I mean, I've gotten people coming up to me. I don't know, the story, the obituary just struck a chord with many people. And I don't know if it's because of the times we live in now that are so much discord that people are looking for a feel-good story and something where somebody overcame hardship and actually can make a life in others, in other people's lives, a difference in other people's lives. And I think it's been really overwhelming from my perspective because for many people that never knew him, they just felt it really made an impact. And I really think that, if in just some little respect, his passing can get people to be a little bit more cordial and, talking again and having a little bit more hope for the future, I think that, even in the end, he would make a difference. And I only hope we can continue his legacy with the dignity, humility, and forethought that my father exemplified. Thank you.
In just a few moments at the conclusion of the service, I will invite you to rise and just remain in your places until the family has left the sanctuary, after which they'll meet you in Kaufman Hall for a reception. And so I'd like to conclude with this prayer. Alfred, may you know that you are always remembered for the good you have done. May you know that you are missed beyond measure. May you know that we see your face, hear your voice, feel your touch. May you know that we bring what you have taught us into our lives. May you know that you continue to travel our journey with us. May you know that by your presence in our lives you have changed us. May you know that we honor your name and your memory today and always. Amen. Please rise.